Hello and welcome to this Impact Cities webinar. My name is Gareth Ragg and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Thank you very much for joining us for what should be an informative and lively discussion on the topic of smart energy powering the urban sustainability revolution. I will introduce you to today's speakers in just a few minutes' time, but it's not just for them to do the heavy lifting on today's webinar. We want your questions as well. So if you look at your screen, you'll see on there a chat box. So at any point during today's discussion, please feel free to jump in there, ask a question, and then I will put that to our speakers during our Q&A session, which we will have after the presentations from our two speakers today. Before we kick things off, though, a quick reminder that this webinar is being produced in the run-up to the Impact Cities Conference. Taking place in Las Vegas on December 4th and 5th is a brand new event whose mission is to connect investors, enterprises, cities and tech leaders to discuss the impacts and opportunities shaping the urban future today. We will have a dedicated track on the future of urban energy, and it will cover in depth many of the topics which we will touch on today's webinar. Also, don't worry about taking too many notes during this today, and we will be distributing the slides and a video of this afterwards. So feel free just to listen in, relax, and ask any questions as and when you may have them. So, to today's expert speakers, we will first kick off with a presentation from Patrick Kelly, who is Project Manager at EDF Renewables, and then this will be followed by Greg Thompson, who is the Founder and Principal at GST, Green Solutions and Technologies. Right, okay, with that, I would like to pass it over to Patrick Kelly, who is going to kick off with today's first presentation. Patrick, can you hear me? And are you ready to go?
I can hear you. I'm ready to go, and I'm sharing my screen. Can you hear me and see my screen?
I can see it. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks, Gareth. My name is Patrick Kelly. I'm the EV Program Manager for EDF Renewables. EDF Renewables is one of the largest independent power producers for clean energy projects. We have about 10 gigawatts of wind and solar projects throughout North America. And we exist as a subsidiary of EDF, or Électricité de France, one of the largest utilities in the world. And the way that we see this market is really starting with California in particular and solving the EV infrastructure. And it's not just for California, but in particular, any high solar penetration state where we expect many states to quickly follow, as California has always done, really leads by about a decade against the other states in North America and really provides a window into the future. And I think it's worth hammering down how important the electrification of transportation is for decarbonization. It makes up over a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions as of 2015. And it's really been about flat over the last couple of decades. And we see this part in particular as being really impactful. In California, the governor has mandated 1.3 million plug-in electric vehicles by 2025 and 5 million by 2030. And as the governor said, the goal is to make their neighborhoods and farms healthier, to meet their ambitious goal, and they need this number by 2030. And this slide comes from the California Energy Commission and highlights that the balance of battery electric vehicles and the plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, things such as the Chevy Bolt or the Prius Prime, versus the battery electric vehicles, the pure battery ones, such as the Bolt or the Tesla. The breakdown of these different types is important to also understand just the charging needs from the different vehicles. The next slide also comes from the California Energy Commission and from a report that came out earlier this year. Many people have called this the dragon curve due to the distinctive jagged edges. The expectation in the product that was produced from NREL and CEC is the expected charging profile. And we see this as a big opportunity. Now, the charging profile based on hour of day, really to highlight what this chart means, is that in blue, residential level 1 is what NREL and the California Energy Commission expect to be the majority and the bulk of the charging, and for it to be done at home. Residential level 2 charging, providing a similar profile where people plug in when they get back from work and they have a charge and they continue charging until about midnight. Workplace charging makes up a smaller portion of it, along with public level 2 charging that may be at retail centers or wherever, and then fast charging making up a smaller component. The way that I really see fast charging is that it's eating candy instead of broccoli. It's fun to do, and it's necessary on long road trips, but when you do it all the time, it tends to imbalance the grid, and it's not nearly as predictable as things such as workplace level 2 charging. The other takeaway from this is that in order to get to just our 2025 target numbers of plug-in electric vehicles, that will require 100,000 additional chargers, level 2 chargers that are either workplace or public, or level 2 destination chargers as California Energy Commission calls them. And currently, the IOUs or the utilities have been granted programs thus far that have given them rate-based money for about $15,000 per charger, and it turns into billions of dollars very quickly. And the way that we see this is that it's not only unsustainable, but it has to come down at least an order of magnitude in order for this to really be sustainable. The other problem with that charging curve, if you look at it and you plug it into the duck curve, is that it could add a gigawatt to the peak load. I'll stop for a moment to explain the duck curve. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with the duck curve, but for those that aren't, it's shown up in this upper right, and it's been the source of what happens when you have deep solar penetration. And what happens is this is the net generation curve, essentially everything minus the solar, minus the renewables. So this is the roller coaster ride that your natural gas peaker plants have to go on. And this in blue shows the actual net demand, so all of your non-solar generating resources from earlier this year. So this was in April 9th. That shows the blue. Now, if we overlay the expected charging onto this grid, it adds a whole gigawatt of load to the peak load, and that, for one, it's just not okay for the grid, and I think we can certainly do better. So even if we were able to say, well, we'll charge in the middle of the night when everybody's sleeping, you can see to the left that home charging really can create a second head to the duck and create a whole nother surge in the middle of the night. 5 million plug-in electric vehicles, essentially level load charged over 4 hours, can add a significant amount to the grid. And same with even 1 million plug-in electric vehicles. Now, from my standpoint, it's pretty obvious that you just want to fill in the hole that we continue to dig as we have more and more solar penetration across the state. And for us, we look at making workplace charging ubiquitous. And there's a number of reasons that make this really the best case solution. By making workplace charging ubiquitous, drivers are twice as likely to get an electric vehicle. The way that we've seen it is that electric vehicles multiply through mitosis. So if you have one out in the parking lot, within a couple of weeks, it'll cell divide into two. And most of that happens because coworkers talk to each other, they talk them through this process, and it happens very quickly. The other part of it is that economically you're reaching a higher diversity of people, as opposed to you have to own your own home, you have to be able to put it in your garage. Well, a lot of people don't have a garage, and there's a lot of people that we have at our own projects or at our own work that live in an apartment complex, have no access at home to electric vehicle charging. So you're really killing two birds with one stone by providing a ubiquitous workplace charging. The problem with providing workplace charging is that plug-in electric vehicles could double the energy consumption and the load in an office building. A small plug-in electric vehicle like an i3 consumes about 8 kilowatt hours per day, assuming 10,000 miles per year, so your average consumer. A large plug-in electric vehicle, such as a Chrysler Pacifica or the soon-to-be-coming larger SUVs, they have smaller efficiency just by their size and nature, and they'll be consuming about 12 kilowatt hours per day. And the average office building consumes about 8 kilowatt hours per employee. So you can do the math real quick and see that you're going to double the electricity upon a workplace if this occurs. So really the way that we see the solution space is that if you're going to provide this additional load, you have to provide additional generation at the same time. And by combining solar storage and energy management, we can provide the lowest cost charging. And it's a really critical mindset and component to look at here, because when you provide a variable generation source such as solar, you don't always know exactly when it's going to produce. It's fantastic to be able to marry it up with a flexible load such as electric vehicle charging. And with that, we can do smart charging. So dumb charging, in California, where we're subject to demand charges, it can really peak and really be significant and translate to a marginal cost of about 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And the reason is that if you have dumb charging, people come in the morning, they plug in at about 8 or 9 a.m., and then they're complete with their charge by about 10 or so. Additionally, if you just roll out 5 charging stations today, 5 more in a year, 5 more the year after that, they tend to really cost about $15,000 per station, which is what the utilities have been claiming. Our perspective is much more on the trench once, permit once, interconnect once. And when you do that and you really look holistically to say, provide solar, provide storage, provide smart energy charging, and in here, 100 smart electric vehicles charging during the day, from a grid perspective, you don't even notice it. You're essentially filling the whole back end. That allows you to have a lower OPEX, a lower CAPEX, because you're combining it with, you're already doing the design work and the engineering work, and it's a lot easier when it is carried by a larger project. And the thing I'd like to close on with this is that we also see the future being vehicle to grid. Now, it's not just a combination, and there are a lot of solutions for providing electric vehicle infrastructure. There's going to be the need for DC fast charging. But the way that we see this, there's a company in San Diego called Nuvi that has really been leading the commercialization of vehicle-to-grid technology. And we can do our standard refill during the day and fill up that load, but maybe it's my manufacturing mindset that wants to try to level load everything that's out there and level load the grid. If we take 1 million vehicles and discharge only 10 kilowatt hours per day, we can reduce the duct head by 4 gigawatts. And 1 million vehicles, 5 or 10 years from now is really not going to be that much. 10 kilowatt hours for a Chevy Bolt, that's only about 20% of their overall battery capacity. So it's not an enormous drain on the vehicles themselves, and they can replenish in the middle of the night, and we eventually get to a very level loaded grid. And to me, this is the key to smart infrastructure and a smart grid of the future, is that we continue to look at all of the levers that we can pull in such a way that we can optimize at a system level. Thanks for your time, Gareth. I appreciate it, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I'll just take control back from you very quickly. Thank you very much for that presentation. That gave us really great insight there. And we've got some good questions coming in off the back of that. So if you've got anything in response to Patrick, any comments, any questions where you'd like him to elaborate a bit further, please look at your screen and you can see the question box in there, and you can drop in there any questions you may have, which I will put to our panelists very shortly. But I won't waste any more time right now. I'm going to pass you over to Greg, who is going to take control from me right now, and he's going to give you his presentation. Are you ready, Greg? And are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. I can see your screen, so I'm giving you control.
Great. Thank you, Gareth. Great presentation, Patrick. The transportation focus is really important. And I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about advanced community energy systems, which actually can address much of the duck curve issues, the peak issues if they happen during the day, surplus solar and how to use that if it happens during the day, as well as what we call the evening ramp here in California due to that duck curve. And this really is a smart energy system or an advanced community energy system for cities and communities. Quick background on me, I've spent many years in the tech startup world here in San Francisco and have moved into clean energy over the last 5 years, focused mostly on how to scale clean energy for communities and cities. I've got a few slides. I've got to go through them fairly quickly, and so they'll be available after the webinar, as will the recording. Essentially, today we've got an inefficient and vulnerable centralized architecture for the grid, as most of you know. We have continued investments in inefficient transmission and sub-transmission infrastructure, peaker plants, centralized generation, etc. With the distribution grid mostly a passive instrument, we can't afford to do that anymore. We have technologies and we have automation and we have needs like electrifying transportation that Patrick talked about, which lead us to a new architecture, which I'll be talking about. Local energy solutions are treated more as an outlier today, and that's why we have things like behind the meter rather than a system solution for local energy. And even California, as one outcome, which has the most solar in the United States, only has about 5% penetration of distributed solar. And we can do much better than that. So we have an opportunity to think through this differently using what I'm calling local energy optimizations, which reduce costs and strengthen the grid. So if you look at rooftop solar, behind the meter, and microgrids, they only serve single customers. Even microgrids that are on campuses are serving a single customer. That's the left picture here. What we're talking about are advanced community energy systems, call it ACEs if you will, that serve most customers. And that's a different approach. We think of this as the grid of the future, so it delivers critical benefits not provided by today's mostly centralized energy system. So it's lowering costs for customers, for ratepayers, because you're reducing the most expensive peak periods and all the associated centralized energy and infrastructure costs that are caused by those aggregated peaks across cities and communities. We're also targeting optimal locations and sizes for these local energy systems, and that reduces the acquisition and generation costs of those systems, which is an important piece of how to get the costs down and deploy local energy systems more rapidly. We also are increasing economic investments, which are incredibly valuable for cities and communities by taking this approach. We're improving the grid performance. We're replacing fossil fuels. We're also reducing the costs and complexities of centralized generation and control, as we mentioned. And we're providing clean energy for growth in all electrification of transportation, homes, and buildings, which is a necessary next big step in reducing carbon emissions and in how we manage and use energy smartly in cities and communities. Another piece of this is we're delivering resilience and security, so this can provide ongoing power to critical and priority locations in cities and communities, which can withstand multiple disaster or cybersecurity scenarios. And this resilience and security is not provided, again, by our centralized system. So we need a distributed architecture to achieve this. And then we have a replicable and scalable model that can work across entire city or community areas and really be scaled. So again, these local energy optimizations as part of an advanced community energy system is a much more efficient way to operate the grid. It lowers the peaks, manages variability and volatility locally rather than exporting it as an aggregated issue up to the centralized system. And we're getting energy resilience and security, which we wouldn't have otherwise. And this means that the distribution and transmission grids, if you want to think of a concept here at a higher level, they become equal partners in grid operations and efficiencies. And this also integrates and incorporates zero carbon, all electric homes and buildings, which are the future. We have a lot of momentum here in California as well as other states in moving this forward. So homes and buildings can then become partners to the grid. And with automation and local optimizations, that improves the economics for everyone. So what is this? Local energy optimization is a system strategy. So the distribution and transmission grids become equal partners, as I mentioned, and there are two complementary objectives: flattening the load shape at a substation and then lowering the overall load amount at that substation. And flattening that load shape means that you take that duck curve, which is the aggregation of all of the substations, for example, in California, and you're actually flattening the load at each substation. So that duck curve really gets flattened and we don't have that huge evening ramp problem anymore. So deploying distributed energy resources with these two objectives as the driving force gets us to these goals of system-wide peak removal and those cost reductions, increasing grid efficiencies across both the distribution and transmission grids. We get clean energy at high penetrations and including support for all electrification of transportation, homes, and buildings, as we mentioned, and energy and resilience and security. So how do you do this? So you determine the optimal load shape, which would be flatter, and load amount, which would be lower at each substation, specifically targeted to reduce the most expensive system-wide costs and inefficiencies. You use specific targets for both energy and power based on that analysis, including current loads and forecasted loads and load shapes, and that includes feeder dynamics, because all of these local energy systems are going to be shared among feeders and across feeders. So you're identifying optimal locations and sizes for specific DER portfolios within your community, within your substation, that can provide both energy and peak reduction to all customers served by that substation. Again, this is in front of the meter, targeted optimal technologies, local energy systems such as solar and storage that are achieving these objectives based on this analysis. And then those local energy systems, that DER, also can provide local resilience and security for critical and priority locations. Again, leveraging the fact that you're sharing this energy and discharging it from storage or sharing it as it's being generated at the optimal times among feeders and across feeders. And this way, the substation becomes a combined load and generation ecosystem that reduces requirements and costs on transmission while simultaneously strengthening. An example would be to reduce the daytime. This was an example we did in a city here in the San Francisco area where the design had the daytime peak reduced by 40%, and that's mostly commercial and industrial, which is mostly your daytime peaks caused by them. Reducing the evening peak by about 20%, which is mostly residential, and supplying 30% of the substation energy needs from local DER, and that's again mostly from the C&I area. And an additional benefit, so combined with the utility's percentage of carbon-free energy mix, this can achieve carbon-free communities faster and for less overall system and ratepayer costs. So here I call this, for fun, the local energy optimization's wheel of fortune. And you can see that if you're looking at the top, it's, you're looking at optimal locations and amounts based on feeder data and dynamics. You can have locally connected feeders at the substation, so you can share energy across those feeders within the substation. You're looking at local load shapes and forecasts, of course, to unlock the optimal locations, customers, and DER portfolios. You're, of course, looking at avoided grid upgrades, both in the distribution grid and transmission grid, based on this approach. And then you have market value of this, so you have rate design, which you can use to incent and continue to grow the right portfolios to accomplish all these objectives. And one key area here to focus on, this is really a local energy opportunity, is what we see as a vastly untapped commercial and industrial energy asset in our smart cities and communities, which is basically one formula for how to achieve low carbon cities. As an example, in this city we worked at here, if we could use a program such as I'm discussing here, an advanced community energy system program, to put solar on 25% of the commercial and industrial rooftops and parking lots, that would equal 25% of the city's annual energy use. And there's a nice match here because these are the largest spaces to generate energy within communities, providing the most output. These locations have the largest daytime loads, which matches the solar generation profile, of course. They have the largest utility bills, including peak demand charges. So these locations are motivated. And in this case, we're talking about lease payments for the solar to be located on the building or on the parking area. It's the best solution for the grid with system peak reduction, and it's usually in the areas where the feeders are more robust and can handle more dynamic energy going back and forth. And this is also the biggest category of emissions within cities and communities, along with transportation. So there's a great match in being able to focus on this as one key strategy for achieving an advanced community energy system. A couple of examples. This is really, saying that the future of energy is going this direction. In Texas, for example, CPS Energy in San Antonio, which is the nation's largest municipal utility, is deploying solar and storage on a feeder, about 5 megawatts of solar, 10 megawatt hours of storage, to do these local optimizations on a feeder with peak midday solar production, the surplus solar stored in the battery and then discharged in the late afternoon and early evening. Of course, that's a flatter load on the feeder. It reduces peak energy demand and cost, increases capacity, provides local resilience, and CPS Energy says this is a scalable solution. Another great example that's a little bit more less targeted, but is still very impactful, is the fact that in California, solar and efficiency is saving about 2.6 billion on power lines here. That's a lot of savings. Essentially, this is based on California's 2017-2018 transmission plan, which approved new projects, but also canceled 20 projects due to solar and energy efficiency, saving us 2.6 billion. And then finally, I'm going to end up here with a couple of slides, but this is really important. In Hawaii, this is the first U.S. state with a legislative mandate to separate utility revenues from capital expenditures. This is a key point, and this is needed going forward. So this new bill will implement performance-based regulation. It breaks the link between utility revenues, their profits, and capital investments, which opens up the opportunity to have advanced community energy solutions as a way of operating, as becoming business as usual in the future. And these performance incentives feature affordability, customer engagement, rapid interconnection of DER, renewables, and also an optimization of the system to help with all that affordability. So reliability is part of it, but also resilience is a question mark there because that wasn't specifically outlined, but that would be part of this new performance-based model for utilities that is essential for us to get the most out of local energy systems and get us to the smart cities and smart communities when it comes to energy. So I think the future of energy is this. I think city governments and municipal entities and CCAs here in California and elsewhere and utilities should all move faster to an ACES future. All customers and residents benefit. It's an optimized local energy solution versus centralized transmission infrastructure, business as usual, aggregated peaks. It supports this big, new, important transition to electrifying transportation and appliances and buildings and electrifying industrial processes. It adds resilience and security that doesn't exist otherwise. It does require service territory analysis and data across loads and peak and all costs of transmission. But we have, of course, the software and the smarts to do these things. And that's how you identify the optimal local energy portfolios for your community areas. It also supports multi-state regional markets for sharing renewable energy, but it does that in a way that reduces the need for how much is shared. And so it simplifies that while also not giving up control. So you can keep control at the state level or the local level. And as mentioned, it does require a new utility it doesn't require, but it would be faster and better to have new utility compensation models that are based on performance and optimization and not based on capital investment. So that's a much better solution for all of us, for cities and communities. And with that, I'll just end with my contact information. If you have any questions about this, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. That's fantastic. I'm just going to take back control for 1 second. And yes, thank you for both of those presentations. Incredibly insightful. And we're just going to open up the floor to some questions in a couple of moments' time. We're going to be going for another 10 minutes or so. So if you do have a question that you're burning to ask, please make sure you go on and ask it now. I've got a few queued up here, so don't be shy. Put your questions into us, and also a quick reminder that we will be sharing the video and the slides with you afterwards. So don't worry if you didn't manage to take any information down if you were trying during that. So let's crack on with some questions from the floor. So I've got a few specific to each of you, but a couple of general ones as well. So I'll start with a general one here from Dustin. He asks, have you guys ever looked at green metrics as a way to monitor any energy production, efficiency, building performance, etc., so that you can build predictive analytics for future planning developments? What do we think to that? Either of you, I'm happy to let you take a run at that. I don't mind.
I suppose I could give a start. Green metrics, on one hand, is rather open of how you'd interpret that. On one side, I could look at LEED certification or Energy Star certification, and I would say from a behind the meter perspective, that's really important. It's important for the buildings. They see that as a key metric, and it incorporates a pretty holistic viewpoint, and adding additional energy efficiency, smart energy, additional solar, whatever it happens to be, will help to improve those metrics. And the best part of Energy Star that we've seen is that it really took off as a market-based demand as opposed to a regulation-based demand, which is always the best because it doesn't require subsidies, and it is also provides the best feedback loop that you can possibly have. You have directly from a customer customer vendor relationship, and talking directly with the building owners and how they are mandating that part of their portfolio being Energy Star because their tenants are demanding it from them.
Yeah, and this is Greg. I would just add that there are other initiatives as well. One is called Grid Optimal. It's by the U.S. Green Building Council and New Buildings Institute, and it's a grid edge initiative to optimize, again, the performance of buildings and homes in relationship to the grid. And so it addresses energy efficiency, of course, but also the automation around that to help reduce costs, and also to help get the most out of the fact that we have this new, energy efficiency, zero net energy, zero carbon automation of processes and appliances, and even transportation is part of this, because this Grid Optimal initiative will help with, what's the right way to clean electrify all of these new approaches.
I have a question here from Manic, and I think it's a fair point, actually. We've been quite California-centric as part of these discussions, and I think you mentioned at the beginning, Patrick, in terms of development, sometimes they can often be up to a decade ahead of the curve. So I suppose to look at the things we've been talking about as a discussion today, is there anything that would be prohibitive in taking these technologies and these initiatives that we're seeing in California and actually taking them elsewhere in the US, or are they genuinely quite replicable across other states and not just California?
Yeah, I'll jump in, because there are a lot of examples of pieces of this sort of advanced approach to community energy happening across the country. It's not a California concept. And in fact, the example I mentioned in my presentation in Texas is really right in the center of that, where you're putting large solar and storage system on a feeder to satisfy the needs of that area of a community. And that is scalable, and it is replicable, and it is something that is simply how the grid can function and should function in any city or community around the country, or around the world, for that matter.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The majority of our distributed solar projects are in the Northeast, and I think we're seeing, like Greg said, in Texas really accelerating, and in general in the South, solar is the lowest cost of energy down there at this time. And I think a combination of the South and the Northeast have a higher value on resiliency, actually, than California. for California, it's been a while since we've had the rolling blackouts, and our short-term memory is only that far. Whereas the Northeast, between Sandy and a few other aspects, they see it every year with hurricane season.
And I guess off the back of that, I suppose in terms of looking more specifically at the electric vehicles, again, California quite ahead of the game on that. Do we see um, how do we see the rollout of EVs or the adoption of EVs wider than California or the coasts? I would probably think within the US. Is it going to be that multiplier effect, or are we going to see it being quite a lot slower? Do you think, not on the seaboards of the adoption?
I think the seaboards will continue to drive that. I think the incentives are still a key component, in particular on the vehicle purchase or lease aspect, that has prevented adoption on some of the other states. California offers $2,500 right off the bat for electric vehicles, but the ZEV states, the ZEV or zero emission vehicle states, as they call them, really encompasses a majority of the Northeast, and I think that's where those incentives and the concentration will continue to accelerate the most. New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Michigan as well. And I think one of the biggest constraints on some of the non-urban or concentrated living areas is always going to be that concern of range anxiety that isn't nearly as big of an issue for urban and suburban areas.
And I guess one final question off the back of that, and I think they are related on looking at EVs, this is from Olaf. It says, Patrick, how is your analysis changing with the sharing economy, i.e., EVs being shared whilst working versus charging at the office? So have you been factoring in the shared economy and the move towards shared mobility rather than that private ownership?
Yeah, it's such a fantastic question. And I think what we see is that it's going to take a long time to do the full adoption, but at the same time, there are other aspects that are very clearly at play. So if you look at one in an urban, I would say most of our projects, we really look at suburban and extra urban areas. In the deep urban areas, I think a lot of people that own parking garages now are looking at them as, I have to figure out something else to do with these. And a lot of that is because of exactly what you said, the sharing economy, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, the Mavens that prevent some of that need. And those are the areas that are the easiest to say, I don't need my own car. In the suburban areas, I think there is no shortage of market segments that will take 2 decades to really fully migrate away from a full sharing economy.
Yeah. So I'm going to move over to you, Greg, for 1 second. And I think that slide at the end when you were talking about Hawaii and the initiative that they have there is actually quite a big deal, because one of the issues when you talk to people around the future of the grid and future of utilities is it does represent quite a distributed energy represents quite a shift away from the tradition. So how do you see the utilities themselves embracing this technology that we've been talking about? Are they seeing this as an opportunity? Are they seeing it as a threat? And how important is that kind of legislation that they're having in Hawaii and Hawaii actually getting around maybe some of their hesitancy or misgivings about this kind of technology or change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I see this as the beginning of a major transition, and that transition is happening both at state levels as well as with utilities themselves. And you'll see this a little more progressed on the municipal utility side. In fact, Green Mountain Energy in Vermont is doing something similar, where they're paying $30 a month to be able to access energy storage in homes and buildings, so they can reduce peaks and save a bunch of money also. So you're seeing pieces of this happening. And here in California, the investor-owned utilities are putting together their grid modernization plans, and I've participated in that and those roadmaps. And the strategy is essentially, I'm a utility and I need to modernize my grid. I need to support a bunch of local energy technologies and systems. And I have that strategy put together, and I've got that roadmap. I'm speaking, of course, as a utility representative for the moment here. And they've worked really hard on this to understand what they can do and how to do it. And they're working on how to get paid for that. And so the sooner we as communities, as city governments, as regulators, as legislators, the sooner we can help with that transition, the faster the utilities will support a lot more of these targeted and optimized and more scalable and less costly local energy systems, these advanced community energy solutions. So we see it happening. It's happening, a step here and a step there. I'd love to see it happen more directed and a lot faster. And we're going to get there at some point. We just need to do it faster.
Great. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to answer everyone's questions. So thank you very much for them all. Sorry if we didn't quite get to yours. But I'm going to finish with one question I've just got here from Maurice. And I'm picking it because it's the buzzword that across most industries that people are talking about, but often people don't quite really understand it or exactly how it's going to be applied. And if you haven't already guessed, I'm going to talk about blockchain. So it says, can the use of blockchain and sensors for distributed energy resources help rebalance the grid's energy at the right time until the very last second? What do we think? How's blockchain going to play a role in this future?
And I'll go quickly, and then maybe Patrick has more to add. But the grid can operate with optimized local energy solutions using smart switching and segmentation, which doesn't require blockchain. And I look at blockchain as a cool new technology that is probably going to have some very good applications, but I don't think it's required. It certainly makes sense if you're trading energy among distributed locations. I don't think that's necessarily going to get us where we need to go faster, which is clean energy for all and low cost and reliable and secure and resilient. So I don't see it as a necessary ingredient at all. The grid can operate in that form without blockchain, although it is an interesting technology that can be applied to certain things.
Patrick, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree. When you're talking about blockchain, it really trends towards a peer-to-peer transaction, as Greg had really mentioned. And do we need that, for one? And for two, how much of that would FERC, NERC, the utilities really allow to even happen? I think it would take a long time to, from a regulatory standpoint, to allow that to happen en masse to make a difference. And I'm mixed on the peer-to-peer value chain. I agree with Greg. I think you can solve a lot of this without bringing a solution that's looking for a problem type of technology.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to thank you both for taking part in the webinar today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gareth.
So thank you very much for listening today. Patrick and Greg will be speaking at the Impact Cities event taking place in Las Vegas on the 4th and 5th of December. As I mentioned at the start, it's a brand new conference and expo where we're going to connect the investors, enterprises, cities, and tech leaders to discuss the impacts and opportunities shaping the urban future. And we have a whole track dedicated to building healthy and sustainable future cities and businesses, covering in even more depth some of these key topics we've been talking about on today's webinar. If you'd like any more information, look at your screen now. All the information is there. I'd just like to point out as well, for those of you lucky people that have been listening to the webinar today, we have an exclusive webinar discount if you'd like to join us in Vegas. Simply all you have to do is use the code that's there on the screen, ImpactWeb, and we will give you an additional $200 off all passes. However, that offer does run out next Friday, so you do have a little bit of time to get that around your team and find out who's going to be coming. So thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure having you today. It's been a pleasure talking to Greg and Patrick, and we'll see you sometime soon. Take care.